Nikola Tesla, he is getting a bit of a popular revival. In part, as we were mentioning, it's because your boss not long ago referred to him as a hero. Everybody's thinking, oh my gosh, if Larry Page thinks he's a hero, maybe we need to learn a little bit more. And then suddenly Elon Musk decides that he's got a car company and a car that's named after this character. So who the heck is he? There's sort of two broad categories of at least those folks that sort of know something about him, at least my experience is. One says that he's the Superman that has provided us these amazing inventions that underlie our economy. The other side says that he's kind of quirky, like he's an odd character. I mean, he abhors jewelry. He gets a fever if he looks at a peach. He counts his steps as he walks, and if they're not divisible by 3, he has to go back and do his whole journey again. So that you've got this sort of contrast, but I guess what I want to do for maybe about 20, 25 minutes or so is talk a bit about some observations that I came up with in the course of doing the research, things that sort of surprised me that may surprise you, hopefully, and then I'd welcome actually just having a dialogue, answering some questions about what you want to know or know about this remarkable individual. So let me start with just my first observation is I was unaware of the extent of his genius. This man got 300 patents. He invented the electric motor. He invented long-distance electricity transmission. According to the United States Supreme Court, he provided us the basics of radio. He did remote control. He did robots. I mean, the list goes on. According to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, were we to seize and eliminate from our industrial world the result of Mr. Tesla's work, the wheels of industry would cease to turn. Our towns would be dark. And that's not all. Long after his death, his visions inspired great minds. I mean, he foresaw cell phones, radar, laser weapons, artificial intelligence, vertical lift airplanes. Cell phones, for instance, this guy's about 110 years ago. He's talking about a device that can provide news and stock prices and all sorts of information. And he said, we shall see and hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distances of thousands of miles. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket. 110 years ago. He didn't invent it, but he sort of thought about it. And that envisioning is, I think, quite amazing. He does come across as a bit of a magician. He would do presentations at various universities, and he would admit that electricity is this force that even physicists will admit they don't fully understand what it is. But he was, and others as well, were able to capture it and utilize it. And in fact, last century, you asked engineers as to what was the major accomplishment of the 20th century. They ignored the internal combustion engine, the computer chip, all these other sort of things. They said the most amazing thing was the ability to capture and transmit electric power. And this man, this magician, was one of those. He created lightning. This was something that had been reserved only for nature, but he zapped it all over the place, hundreds and hundreds of feet. He also made lamps glow. They were not attached to wires. So this man was in fact a magician, but you should also recognize that he had some quixotic notions that complicated his legacy or made him more interesting, depending upon your perspective. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to communicate with intelligent beings on other planets. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to read your mind by putting little monitors near your retina. So he was both practical as far as coming up with, if you will, systems. He was a visionary in thinking about new things that he couldn't actually make because the equipment or technology just wasn't there. And he was also a little weird and off sometimes. And I think it's that combination that makes him so interesting. The second surprise for me As was noted, I'm an environmentalist. I run the Midwest office of the Environmental Defense Fund, working on clean energy issues. And so for me to find out that Nikola Tesla, not only did he invent the electric motor, but he also was a clean energy pioneer. That to me was pretty exciting. And he remains an inspiration, I think, to a variety of solar and battery manufacturers. Elon Musk, who we mentioned before, has his car and his company named after him, but he contributed $1 million to revitalize the Tesla laboratory up on Long Island. I actually work in a shared office space. It's a sort of a startup incubator, and there is, right 10 feet behind my desk, there is a full-sized cutout of Nikola Tesla that at least I used to tell my wife was haunting me from behind to go home and write more. But his leadership on clean energy began actually in 1900, about 118 years ago. He published an article in The Century, which then was the nation's largest circulation periodical. It was entitled "The Problem of Increasing Human Energy with Special References to the Harnessing of the Sun's Energy." Again, published 118 years ago, was probably the earliest, most detailed look at how to capture power from the sun and the wind. For me, as an environmental advocate, he inspires me to think of, if he was here today, how great it would be to focus on the electricity industry, which he helped start. But today, largely because it is monopolized, in other words, the electric utilities have total control in many states over both the generation and the delivery of electricity. This industry has become innovation averse, has become risk adverse, it has become stodgy, it has become frayed, the list goes on. If in fact Tesla was around, he'd be off thinking about, how am I going to send power wirelessly? How am I going to make it without having pollution? How am I going to electrify other sectors of the economy, particularly transportation? How am I going to bring drudgery-saving electric power to everyone around the world, perhaps for free, including that we have 2 billion people on this planet that do not have access to electricity at this moment. He, in my mind, if he were with us today, would be thinking outside of the box, away from the sort of the monopoly think that currently degrades that industry. My third surprise was his constant attempt and need to balance the present and the future. Call it apocryphal, call it weird, call it appropriate, but he was born during a giant lightning storm exactly at the stroke of midnight between the 9th and 10th of July, 1856. That's weird enough, just in the midst of a gale. And this became part of Tesla lore. His family sort of thought this was, this is how Nikola came in. And he, I think, thought he was kind of special because he had this trait that he was born at this weird time. For me, as a biographer, I was able to get the sense that, in fact, the birth story sort of figuratively placed him in the present as well as in the future, both today and tomorrow. And I think he spent his life trying to struggle to find this balance between focusing on current realities and envisioning the future, the unknown. And consider, for example, the year 1897. He had just figured out how to transmit the enormous power from Niagara Falls, 26 miles all the way to Buffalo, and then a total of 400 miles down to New York City. This is huge because the technology that Thomas Edison, who everybody looks towards of thinking he was the electrical genius, he, however, favored direct current, which could basically move maybe half a mile, maybe a mile if you were lucky. Tesla was able to move this power 400 miles. The New York Times referred to this Niagara project as the unrivaled engineering triumph of the 19th century. And who did the paper give credit to? They said, to Tesla belongs the undisputed honor of being the man whose work made this Niagara project possible. And of course, there are statues to him on both sides, Canadian and United States. he did this amazing thing. He was praised, by the Times, at parties, etc. And he was bored. This was too much today. He had done this. He needed to look towards the future to create a new area of science, and he called this telematonics, or what we might call robotics. His initial project was a radio-controlled model boat, measured about, 4 feet in length and maybe about 3 feet high. And he, although he was a rather shy scientist, he was capable of being a showman if he had to. And so he had the debut of this telematon at the Madison Square Garden, huge arena. This is the old one, but this is where it happened, during the Electrical Exposition in May 1898. Remember, this is about 2 months after the battleship Maine had blown up in Havana Harbor. We were in the midst, just the beginning of the Spanish-American War, so there was a lot of interest in trying to figure out, can we develop new weapons? And so here comes Tesla. He has this model boat. He builds a pond in the middle of the exhibition hall, and he invites possible investors, reporters, other inventors and scientists, and he tantalized them for 15 or 20 minutes. He moved the boat backwards and forwards around the pond. He made it dance almost like a water bug. And so everybody was mesmerized by this. Some people were thinking, there's a tiny monkey in there. I'm sure there's a tiny monkey in there. But then after a while, he then turns to the audience and says, all right, who wants to ask the boat a question? And everybody's thinking, you don't ask boats questions. Some probably future Google person came up and said, all right, what's the cube root of 64? And Tesla, with his hand hidden on a lever underneath the panel, arranges to flick the lights on the boat 4 times. And he said he created a sensation such as no other invention of mine has ever produced. His success at this was further highlighted by Marconi's failure. Remember, Marconi is the one who's given public credit for wireless transmissions. But about 3 months later, Marconi tried to do a very similar project, built his own pond. He built a model frigate that he was to guide over to what was referred to as the Spanish boat, and it would have little bombs on it, would blow the tiny little Spanish boat to smithereens. Unfortunately, Marconi had not mastered how to send individualized messages. So when his assistant punched the button, the Spanish ship was just fine. But there was a loud explosion in the back room where Marconi had kept his miniature bombs, because that's where the signal went. He hadn't figured out how to get it to the right spot. And so there were loud blasts and smoke that went throughout the exhibition hall. Not surprisingly, Tesla was never satisfied with just, a model boat. And to the Navy, he was not satisfied to suggest this was a submarine that would carry bombs to blow up a frigate. That was kind of boring. They're thinking, it's the Spanish-American War, this is great. But he thinks this is a new non-biological form of life. This is a machine that is embodied with a borrowed mind. This mind, of course, happens to be his. But he's foreseeing artificial intelligence, and he's predicting that this telematon not only would, quote, follow a course laid out or obey commands given far in advance, but it will be capable of distinguishing between what it ought and what it not ought to do. This is, again, over 100 some odd years ago. We were beginning to think, in his mind, about artificial intelligence. My fourth surprise, actually, as I was telling Richard, resulted from the discovery at the Library of Congress of boxes of letters that either Tesla had written or had been written to him by friends or colleagues, etc. From a biographer's perspective, this is like manna from heaven. Suddenly you get to see this man's voice in real time. What those letters showed, I think, was an overlooked side to this remarkable genius. As I mentioned at the beginning, you've got this school of people who think that he was a Superman. In fact, one biographer called him a supernova in the galaxy of the human race. And no doubt the combination of electric motors, robots, remote control, radio, these are all super accomplishments. I'm not taking anything away from that. But this scientist was also human, and charmingly so. And that was the fun part to sort of get behind and tell that story. His closest friends were the Johnsons. Robert, who edited the Century magazine, which I mentioned before was the largest circulation periodical, and his wife, Catherine, they operated an intellectual salon at their townhouse in Manhattan's Murray Hill neighborhood. They were not particularly rich, but they sort of acted that way. And they gathered around them this cadre of writers, artists, and sculptors and would have them over for all these great dinner conversations. Mark Twain came to most of these, and he and Nikola Tesla became great friends. This is Mr. Twain, and Tesla there is in the background. So he would come to Tesla's laboratory, and the two of them would just play. They'd send electrical sparks across the room. They'd, hold up, globes that were unconnected to wires and make them, glow. They would X-ray each other's hands. They were two kids having a great time in their laboratory. They just happened to be the genius, the engineering genius of the time, and perhaps the best writer at our time. One cute story about this is that when they first met, Tesla recalled that when he was 14 years old, he had been quite sick, and his parents had given him some Mark Twain novels. And at least according to Tesla, he told Mark Twain that you saved my life because I got through this sickness. And then Tesla said, commented upon Twain, he said, this great man of laughter broke out into tears. I just thought that was so cute. So the two of them were, a pair, but I think this relationship that Tesla had with both Robert and Catherine reveals sort of a jovial and relaxed side to this usually intense inventor. They exchanged almost daily notes. They were talking about their health, the writings of other scientists, Tesla's latest inventions, the state of the Johnson kids. Just to give you one sense of one letter, when Tesla had had a cold for a little while, Robert wrote to him and he said, "It's been a whole week since we saw you, and you need cheering up. Come as early as possible and get cheered. We're in a jolly mood, and the fire is lighted on the hearth, and we only need you." So here is this unbelievably intense inventor who really loved to spend most of his time by himself in his lab. He was human. Charmingly so, would be my observation. He never married. He did fall in love once with a woman that I never found out her last name was Anna, supposedly beautiful eyes, and the two of them, when he was 23 years old, they would walk through Austrian parks and plan how they were going to have a big family, and he was going to go off to engineering school. That did not happen. He went off to engineering school. The relationship did not pursue. But he later would admit that inventors are not to be intimate. That was sort of his conclusion. He said, you can be a musician, you can be an artist. You can be all these sorts of things, but if you're an inventor, you're too intense. And if you become married, that will take away from the intensity and focus that you need to have. And there was one sad note near the end of his life, and he says, yeah, that may be true, but it also makes us lonely. So this very human scientist, I think, also give us lessons about the role and the example of being a discoverer and an inventor. He reveled most in the excitement of discovery. I just have a few pictures of him going through his life. He would say, "I do not think there is any thrill that can go through the human heart like that felt by the inventor as he sees some creation of the brain unfolding to success. Such emotions make a man forget food, sleep, friends, love, everything." So where did this come from? Where did this inventing spirit come from? Some has to be just innate. The guy was bright. I mean, he could speak 8 languages fluently. He could recite lengthy poems and stories just from memory. He also had a father who was a Serbian Orthodox priest who gave him mental exercises. He had to remember sequences of numbers. He had to, recite long stories, and sort of the list goes on. He also was a little strange. This man who was born during a midnight lightning storm, when he was young, used to have strobing light flashes in his brain that led him to admit that sometimes he couldn't tell the difference between reality and something that was fake. It also sort of led him to go off on journeys, mental journeys. So he had daytime and nighttime sort of dreams where he would travel around the world to new lands, meet new people who were almost, real friends, to him. So where did it come from? Exercise, natural brilliance, and a little bit of strangeness, I think. But that's probably true of all of us. Not that yours truly is any genius, but it is that combination. He, however, had a particular type of invention that I think is somewhat missing today, and that's unfortunate. His was a curiosity-driven quest for discovery or for invention, and it was motivated by idealism. And this is in contrast to Thomas Edison, who basically invented because he was an entrepreneur and he wanted to make money, and nothing wrong with that. But Tesla, although he certainly enjoyed his fancy dinners at the Delmonico's, and he had a nice apartment at the Waldorf Astoria, but he said that technology transcended the marketplace, that invention should not just be tied to profits. He wrote, "The desire that guides me in all I do is the desire to harness the forces of nature to the service of mankind." So what does this teach us, if you will, about his inventing style that we might utilize today? One observation, two. One is that he firmly demonstrated the link between a love of humanities and the love of science. He loved poetry, would recite it at length, was deeply into, as I said, foreign languages and foreign literature, etc. And to give you an example, he envisioned his revolutionary electric motor, the thing that made the electricity industry possible. He envisioned it while walking through a Budapest park, quoting Goethe's Faust. And then he picked up a stick and drew a little design of it in the sand. It's this mix of humanities and science that I think we are somewhat missing today. We separate them more than, I guess, Tesla would argue is necessary. The other observation, and sort of my final one, is that he would observe, I think, that we have moved too far away from the individualization of the inventor or the discoverer. We now do things with teams. And this is not a knock at all on teams, but a lot of inventing, as you probably know, you have your own teams here. There are teams, at universities, research centers, corporate laboratories, etc. And they work marvelously. But what's missing, he would argue, is that sometimes you just need the isolated individual who's free enough to go out there and be stupid and alone. That's not to say he needed to balance, again, this envisioning, individualized inventing with some reality. And he did that largely because he had, at least for a brief period of his life, a lawyer who kept him in check. And he needed that. So it's not like you just have some individual wacko out there just thinking about the future. You do need a team, if you will, but he would argue you don't need as big of teams as we currently mostly focus on. I don't know if that's true. I'd welcome your insights on that one, but that would be my guess of what he would come at this. My final comment is that I think he aimed high, perhaps higher than any other inventor. Just a few more shots of him. He worked tirelessly to bring electric power freely to the world, and he built robots that he thought would reduce life's drudgery. He was, in short, driven by inner forces that made sheer creation the most important thing in his life, and we are the better for it. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy reading about this mastermind, and I also hope that you help give him more of the due recognition that at least I, and your boss, thinks that he deserves. So I'm happy to take a few questions. There are books that are available for people that are here, but I'd welcome some questions and some dialogue. What do you want to know? Or what do you know?
I'll start off with one.
Oh, good.
So how did he end up? What's the end of the story?
He ended up poor and alone, lived his final days sort of isolated in the Hotel New Yorker, where he refused to see anyone and would restrict the maids and others from actually spending much time with him and just sort of shoving his gruel to him. And the only reason that he even had enough money at the end was because some scientists at the Westinghouse Corporation, which he essentially made possible because he formed this partnership with George Westinghouse to do the Niagara Falls project. And so Westinghouse bought initially his patents for his electric motor. But at the end, it was a few scientists at the Westinghouse Corporation that convinced the corporation that it was an embarrassment to their company that he had just declared bankruptcy, and they needed to give him enough of a stipend so that at least he could survive. Now that said, he died, I forget the room number in the Hotel New Yorker, but it was divisible by, very good, and more than 2,000 people then attended his funeral service at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City up by Columbia University.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's really nice to see someone speak without a teleprompter here at Google.
Oh, really? Okay.
Most people use it,
right.
But it's nice when it's natural. So my question is, you told this story about when he was born. How much do you think someone's success is based on what they believe they can do throughout their life versus their natural born, intelligence?
Well, this is a tough one for Nikola, and this is probably a longer answer than you wanted, but his life, his early life, up until he was about 7 years old, was blissful. He had 2 older sisters that doted on him, lived on a farm, had a great time. But when he was 7 years old, his older brother Dane, who was then, I think, 12 or 13, and he was Nikola's idol and was the family favorite, was considered gifted beyond all means, and he would follow his father into the priesthood. Unfortunately, the family's white stallion bolted and threw his brother to the ground, and he died that night from his injuries. And Nikola there witnessed this. I mean, so this was a real changing event in his life. Where this comes back to your comment is that you would think his parents would then say, oh, we've got a remaining son. Let's focus on him. But no. His mom and dad are thinking, oh, if only Dane had lived, he would have been great. Think of the amazing accomplishments that he would have had. So Nikola claims that he grew up without any sense of confidence, because anything he did that was noteworthy, his parents would think, oh, Dane might have done it better. So he had this constant struggle to find his father's affection. And it never came. In fact, this is far more than your question wanted, but I mean, he ended up finally getting his father to allow him to go to engineering school, and he did it for 2 years and got stellar marks. But whenever he got stellar marks, his father was still, oh, Dane could have been better. And so he drops out of school. Nikola Tesla drops out of school, takes up gambling and billiards, moves secretly to a town like 200 miles away, gets arrested for vagrancy, and is brought back by the police to his parents. You can imagine they're not exactly happy, and I'm not suggesting this is a model for any Google tenure, and his father died not long after that, just from the shock. So I don't know that. I mean, he's not an example of someone who was told all your life you are the greatest. He was told that he was not the greatest, and yet he persevered, and in part he persevered in response to his father, trying to get his father's attention. And he said that he went through these strobing, intense light dreams that he had were in part sort of a response to this father figure. But no, he did not grow up with confidence. It was actually quite the opposite.
Tesla, as we're discussing, is a bit of a cult figure in odd ways, and actually turns up in popular culture. He's shows up in some movies in a somewhat ahistorical fashion. What's your take on that? How?
Well, the thing that amazes me is that as I wrote this book, my publicist posted a small excerpt of it on a Nikola Tesla club. I think it was based in Chicago. And then suddenly, the Nikola Tesla club in Toronto picked it up. And then there was a Nikola Tesla club in Minneapolis. There are hundreds of these things, and they're fervent followers of the man. So the dialogue that goes back and forth on whether what I wrote was halfway true or their new theory of some conspiracy that was associated with his final days, and whether he in fact did do a death beam and the CIA has squashed it. So yes, he has a cult following. In the movie, the perfect person played him in one movie, David Bowie. Is that not great? David Bowie and Nikola Tesla. And yes, they were not exactly accurate in their depictions. They had this one scene where Tesla's one dream was that he was going to send electricity into the earth, bursts of lightning, artificial lightning, if you will, into the earth, and take advantage of what he felt was the earth's natural electrical charge, and also take advantage of resonance or an echo force, so that he could have this charge go throughout the planet, and people could basically, plug something into the earth and have free power, essentially. Well, in this movie, it's really quite great. The stars are out there. They're screwing light bulbs, like hundreds of them, across this field. That did not happen. But he does have indeed a cult following, and I think. I think it's fair, because I think it's in part, he hasn't received the recognition that, say, Edison or Marconi have. And this is not any knock on those great inventors, but the New York Times in their obituary basically said that it was Tesla who was the inventor of radio, and it was Tesla who brought us the electric motor and electricity transmission. And I don't think most people recognize that and give him his due. So if that necessitates also having kind of the weirdness involved, okay. What other questions?
Anything else?
Yeah, please.
Hi. So I was really curious about you saying that he died poor and he's like this great inventor. And I wanted to know what what did he feel about being rewarded, at least monetarily, for this passion that he had?
Mm-hmm.
And also yourself as a writer, and writers in general also being such hard workers and not being remunerated.
Boy, is that the truth. I'm not exactly answering your question, but let me try an angle, and you can tell me if I get there. He actually could have been amazingly wealthy. When he sold his electric motor patents to George Westinghouse, he was living high on the hog. As I said, he was eating his meals at Delmonico's every night, filet mignon. He lived in a large apartment at the Waldorf Astoria, probably the best hotel then in New York City. He had tons of money. But Westinghouse, in large part because J.P. Morgan, the banker, who was not exactly a nice man, he wasn't, tried to squeeze out George Westinghouse not long after the Niagara project, which is, they obviously spent a lot of money to make this happen, and so they were a little cash short, and the economy sort of just does its cycles, and this was in one of the cycles, so Westinghouse was in not great shape. And J.P. Morgan basically tried to squeeze him out and said, you either cut expenses immensely, or you give your company to me, and I'll create the total electricity trust, just like what he did with the steel industry. So Westinghouse goes to Tesla and says, I'm in a real jam here. I'm about to lose my company. And you have this royalty, $2.50 per horsepower of motor. I can't afford it. Tesla's sitting there. He has all the cards. He has the patent. He has the contract. And he's not a really good businessman. So he turns to George Westinghouse and says, "Oh, you've been nice to me. You're the one who will bring my electric motor to the world. I'm willing to tear up my contract." He tore up $1 billion of money that would have come his way simply, number one, I don't think he was a great businessman, and he certainly was a horrible negotiator, but because he was an idealist. Here was a man who was going to bring his invention, which he thought was the greatest thing in the world. And I'm not going to argue with that. And for that, he was willing to sacrifice an amazing amount of wealth. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I like that story better. Well, the lawyer had died about a year before. I know. This is when you need a lawyer. There are so many times you don't, but this time you did. What other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thanks very much. I was wondering if you ran into any associations of Tesla with the Boston area at all during your research. There's a Tesla Ave in Medford over by Tufts, and I've heard stories that he used to live over there. So
I don't know that he lived here. There is a very interesting MIT connection, which I probably shouldn't say. So in his later years, when he was, to be honest, a little bit senile, but also had flashes of genius, he would have birthday parties for himself, and he'd invite reporters. And really, 50 of the major reporters from the New York Times, the New York Herald, Time Magazine, all these people would come and sit at his feet for like 5 hours as the great man would ramble on, 90% of the time about gibberish, and 10% of the time about something, oh my God, So one of his visions during these birthday parties was a death beam, something like Star Wars that could zap battleships and airplanes out of the air. All right, we're talking in the early 1940s, at a time when we're about to go to war, and the thought of Nikola Tesla dying, and he had the designs possibly for a death beam, did not make the Federal Bureau of Investigation all that excited about allowing his papers to go anywhere in the world. So they hired an MIT physicist and assembled all of his papers together, which were huge boxes. And he spent at least a week, if not a couple of weeks, being overseen by naval intelligence and federal FBI agents as he went through the documents. And there was one that he actually put the top secret clearance on because it was, in his mind, close enough to being practical that it needed to be considered to be top secret. The rest of it, he says, is basically the ramblings of an old man. And I say that feeling old, but here's the critical question. Does anybody know who the MIT professor was that they hired to do this? John Trump. John Trump was a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He won the National Academy of Sciences Award. He also happens to be the uncle of the 45th President of the United States. How's that? And in fact, when the current President of the United States was running for office, he would refer to his uncle as somebody really bright. Notice that I have a lot of smart genes. I'm really bright. It's because that's my only sort of Boston connection through MIT was through Mr. Trump. What other questions?
So what brought them from Austria to the U.S.?
He came because he had been installing Edison phone systems in Budapest and Paris. To be honest, he had been spending most of his time thinking about electricity, and in the Budapest Park, envisioned the engine. But he had done such a great job that his supervisors sent him to New York to actually work with Thomas Edison himself. And they sent him with probably the greatest letter of recommendation that's ever been written. They said to Thomas Edison, this letter to Thomas Edison, "I know of two great men. You were one of them, and this young man is the other." So they worked together, actually, but I mean, they were totally different temperaments. I mean, Edison was frumpy. He was crass. I mean, he was a genius. I'm not, there's no knock on him. He just sort of was. Tesla, was this, immaculately, refined cosmopolitan that spoke 8 languages, knew literature fluently, and looked like he dressed like he was ready to go to the opera, during the day. So the two of them just, they were different sort of characters, and they argued vehemently about how to transmit power. I mean, Edison wanted to do it through direct current because he thought it was, number one, his, and safer was his biggest argument. And Tesla was far more interested in trying to send it long distances so that more people could take advantage of it. And in fact, this is more than your question was, but they split because Edison refused to provide the promised bonus if Tesla would increase the efficiency of one of the dynamos or generators. And Tesla had worked like 3 months to triple the output of this thing. Then he goes to the Wizard of Menlo Park, who he still idolized at this time. And Edison basically just mocked him and said, "Oh, come on, that was a joke." And then, to this young immigrant who's still a little sensitive about being in the United States, he says, "You're such an immigrant. If you were only an American, you'd appreciate an American joke." Edison, of course, did not laugh. He put on his bowler hat, appropriately so, and walked out and quit his job and started his own company. So that's how he got to the United States.
All right, well, thank you very much again. It was wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys having me. And I hope you enjoy the book.